Reinhard Heydrich died in June 1942 at the age of 38, following an attack in the streets of Prague. At that time, he held one of the most feared positions in the Third Reich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, organizer of the Wannsee Conference, and administrator of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. His own colleagues nicknamed him the Blonde Beast or the Butcher of Prague. But behind the official biography, repeated in books and documentaries, there is a layer of lesser-known episodes, rumors about his Jewish origin, falsified files that unleashed a massive purge in the Soviet Union, a concealed naval expulsion, a death that could have been avoided with a simple bulletproof vest, and a post-war mythology that still generates debate among historians. 18 fragments of that less-traveled history make up this journey. The rumor of Jewish blood that followed him throughout his life. For years, suspicion circulated in Nazi circles that Heydrich had Jewish ancestry on his paternal grandmother's side. Ernestine Lindner, whose second married surname, Süss, fueled confusion with Jewish surnames common at the time. The actual genealogy establishes that none of Heydrich's direct ancestors was Jewish, but the rumor became so firmly established in Halle, his hometown, that schoolmates and naval recruits teased him by calling him Isidor, or the White Jew. Heinrich Himmler himself ordered an exhaustive genealogical investigation in 1932 before admitting him to the SS, precisely to settle the matter, and the official result declared him pure Aryan. That report, however, did not eliminate the previous social stigma. Some biographers maintain that Heydrich's obsession with demonstrating absolute loyalty to Nazi racial ideology, taking it to extremes that surpassed many of his superiors, was motivated in part by the desire to erase any shadow of doubt about his racial purity. The paradox is evident. The man who coordinated the bureaucratic machinery of genocide carried throughout his adult life a nickname that falsely linked him to the victims of that same machinery. Documents from the British Intelligence Service, declassified decades later, show that this personal vulnerability was studied as a possible point of psychological pressure, although it was never used directly in counterintelligence operations. The origin of the rumor dates back to a marriage announcement published in 1916 by his grandmother after she was widowed, in which the surname Süss appeared alongside that of her second husband. In early 20th century Halle, that surname was enough to trigger suspicions in a social environment where everyday anti-Semitism formed part of the cultural landscape, even before the rise of Nazism as an organized political movement. Fellow naval cadets recalled decades later that Heydrich responded to the mockery with disproportionate aggression, at times even engaging in physical confrontations with those who repeated the nickname. Biographers such as Mario Dederichs and Robert Gerwarth agree in pointing out that this early experience of harassment, added to the humiliation of the naval expulsion that will be detailed below, contributed to shaping an almost compulsive need for external validation through professional success and extreme ideological loyalty. The 1932 genealogical report, specifically commissioned by Himmler, traced 4 generations of Heydrich's ancestors without finding any Jewish connection, but the speed with which that investigation was demanded before accepting him into the SS reveals how heavily the rumor still weighed, even within the circles that would later turn him into one of the most recognizable faces of the Nazi state's institutional anti-Semitism. An expulsion from the Navy that the Nazi regime completely covered up. Before becoming one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi security apparatus, Heydrich was an officer in the Kriegsmarine. In 1931, he faced a naval court of honor for breaking his engagement to a young woman, the daughter of an influential industrialist, in order to marry Lena von Osten, whom he had met only weeks earlier. The naval tribunal, presided over by Admiral Erich Raeder, found him guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman and expelled him from the Navy in disgrace. The version that later circulated in Nazi propaganda presented his departure as a voluntary decision motivated by budget cuts under the Weimar Republic, a narrative that suited both Heydrich and the regime, which was interested in portraying its leaders as having spotless records. Lena, his wife, played a decisive role in this episode. It was she who encouraged him to seek work in the SS through a family contact with Himmler, transforming what seemed like the end of his military career into the beginning of a far more lethal trajectory. Without that expulsion, which official Nazi history took care to conceal, Heydrich would probably have continued as a mid-ranking naval officer, and the architecture of the Third Reich's repressive apparatus would have taken a different course. The Court of Honor file, partially preserved in German naval archives, details that the abandoned fiancée, identified as Erika, belonged to a family with direct ties to senior Navy commanders, which explains the severity of the punishment for behavior that, under other circumstances, would have merited a simple reprimand. Admiral Raeder, who personally presided over the tribunal, left a written record stating that he considered Heydrich a technically competent but morally unstable officer, an assessment that circulated informally among the Naval Officer Corps for years. Later, Nazi propaganda, especially that produced after his death to construct the narrative of the martyr, completely replaced this version with a narrative of budget cuts resulting from the restrictions imposed on Germany after the First World War, an explanation that was far more convenient for a figure whom the regime needed to present as having no blemishes in his career. Lena von Osten, for her part, was already actively involved in National Socialist circles before meeting Heydrich, and it was precisely through her father, an early sympathizer of the party, that contact was established with an SS officer who recommended Heydrich for a direct interview with Himmler in 1931. That interview, which according to later testimonies lasted only a few minutes, was enough for Himmler to immediately offer him the task of organizing an internal intelligence service for the Nazi Party from scratch, the germ of what would later become the feared Sicherheitsdienst. The violinist who played Beethoven before signing extermination orders, Heydrich inherited from his father, Bruno Heydrich, founder of a music conservatory in Halle, a remarkable talent for the violin. Witnesses from his family circle described evenings in which he performed pieces by Beethoven and Mozart with a sensitivity that contrasted radically with his professional behavior. Lena, his wife, recounted in later memoirs that her husband played chamber compositions late into the night, sometimes as a form of decompression after days devoted to planning repressive operations. Some historians specializing in the psychology of perpetrators point to this contrast as a case of extreme compartmentalization, the ability to hermetically separate aesthetic sensitivity from systematic cruelty. Heydrich himself even organized chamber concerts in Prague during his tenure as Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, inviting SS officers and Protectorate officials to musical sessions at Prague Castle, the same building from which he ordered mass deportations to the extermination camps in the East. This duality was not a well-kept secret among his contemporaries, but popular historiography tends to omit it in favor of a monolithic image of bureaucratic coldness, when the documentary evidence suggests a considerably more complex personality and, for many specialists, more disturbing precisely because of that coexistence of artistic refinement and genocidal planning. Bruno Heydrich, his father, had founded the Halle Conservatory of Music and composed several operas of little commercial impact, including one titled Amen, which he unsuccessfully attempted to position within the Wagnerian circuit. This musical heritage profoundly marked Reinhard's childhood, as he received formal violin training from the age of 5 and, according to family accounts collected by biographers such as Callum MacDonald, even considered a career as a professional musician before turning toward military life. During his time at the head of the security service, he formed an informal string quartet together with 3 other amateur officers, with whom he rehearsed weekly when his schedule allowed, even during the periods of greatest operational intensity in the planning of the deportation of European Jews. An aide-de-camp recounted after the war that Heydrich demanded absolute silence during his nightly practice sessions, and became visibly irritated if any administrative interruption broke the concentration necessary to perform a piece correctly. This ability to emotionally isolate artistic activity from the rest of his professional life led some forensic psychiatrists, in retrospective analyses published decades later, to classify his profile within a personality spectrum characterized by a notable functional dissociation between aesthetic sensitivity and the absence of empathy toward the victims of his administrative decisions. The fencer who trained as if the sword were an extension of his body. In addition to the violin, Heydrich cultivated fencing with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He practiced both saber and foil from adolescence and continued training regularly during his years in the SS, eventually competing in national-level tournaments. Colleagues from the time described his style as aggressive and calculating, marked by a physical agility that surprised those who knew him only for his administrative profile. This athletic skill was combined with intensive practice in swimming and skiing, disciplines in which he also excelled. His interest in hand-to-hand combat went beyond sport. Within the SS, Heydrich promoted a cult of physical superiority as a complement to the racial superiority preached by Nazi ideology, and demanded standards of physical fitness from the officers under his command that many considered excessive. An anecdote documented by several biographers indicates that during a training session in 1938, he accidentally injured a sparring partner so severely that the incident was recorded in the unit's medical files. The combination of technical precision and aggressiveness he displayed with the sword was transferred, according to later interpretations, to the way he carried out repressive policies, methodical, swift, and devoid of hesitation. Heydrich came to represent sports clubs in Halle and later Kiel in regional fencing competitions, a discipline in which his height and reach, physical characteristics that his contemporaries described as imposing, gave him a considerable advantage over shorter opponents. Navy colleagues recalled that he practiced fencing bouts even on deck during long voyages, using improvised equipment when regulation gear was unavailable. Once in the SS, he promoted the creation of fencing and physical education academies for young officers, convinced that bodily discipline strengthened the character necessary to carry out orders without hesitation, a philosophy he openly shared with Himmler, who similarly valued physical development as an ideological component of the Nazi racial ideal. His fondness for skiing led him to compete in downhill events in the Bavarian Alps during several winters, and his swimming ability, perfected during his years of naval training, remained a regular practice even during the years of greatest administrative workload at the head of the Reich Main Security Office. This obsession with extreme physical performance, documented in multiple sources from those close to him, helped build an image of invulnerability among his subordinates that, paradoxically, reinforced the excessive confidence that would ultimately expose him without adequate protection on the day of the attack that would cost him his life. The false files that he himself fabricated to destroy the Red Army. One of the lesser-known episodes of Heydrich's career occurred in 1936 and 1937, when the SS Security Service, under his direction, participated in the fabrication of documents linking Soviet Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky to an alleged conspiracy to overthrow Stalin in collusion with German officers. The operation, known in part of the historical literature as the Tukhachevsky case, involved forged letters and communications that eventually reached Stalin himself through Czechoslovak and French intelligence channels. The result was devastating for the Red Army. Tukhachevsky and a considerable number of senior Soviet military commanders were executed in 1937 after summary trials within the framework of Stalin's Great Purge. Historians such as Robert Conquest and later researchers with access to declassified Soviet archives have debated the exact extent of German influence in this episode, since Stalin harbored his own suspicions toward his high command independently of any external manipulation. The active participation of Heydrich's apparatus in the fabrication of evidence constitutes, in any case, a fact verified by multiple documentary sources. The practical result was that Heydrich, without moving a single German soldier, contributed to significantly weakening the Soviet Union's military leadership just 4 years before the German invasion of 1941, a strategic benefit that is rarely attributed to him in conventional accounts of the Eastern Front. The forgery operation involved a white Russian intelligence agent, Nikolai Skoblin, who served as an intermediary to introduce the fabricated material into channels that ultimately reached the Soviet and Czechoslovak intelligence services, creating the illusion that the information came from independent and reliable sources outside the Nazi apparatus. Heydrich personally supervised the preparation of letters that simulated correspondence between Tukhachevsky and officers of the German General Staff, using paper, ink, and diplomatic formats carefully replicated to withstand any possible forensic analysis of the time. Historian Gerwarth documents that Heydrich even boasted privately before close associates about the success of the operation, considering it one of his most valuable contributions to Germany's strategic security, at a time when the Soviet-German military cooperation of the 1920s still generated concern among Nazi intelligence services about the true potential of the Red Army. The resulting purge was not limited to Tukhachevsky. It swept away 3 of 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and a significant proportion of the senior officer corps, a depletion of military experience that various military historians, including David Glantz, consider a relevant, though not exclusive, factor in the initial difficulties faced by the Red Army during the first months of the German invasion of 1941. Stalin himself, according to accounts from those around him collected by Soviet historians during the period of archival openness following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, maintained for years a certain conviction that the conspiracy had been real, a belief that some analysts attribute to the lasting effect of the intelligence operation designed by Heydrich, capable of sowing doubts that survived even the later documentary review. The forgery of the letters required a remarkable level of technical sophistication for the time, including the use of Russian-origin paper obtained through smuggling channels and the imitation of signatures verified through handwriting samples previously collected by German intelligence agents infiltrated into Soviet diplomatic circles. This episode, frequently reduced to a footnote in general biographies of Heydrich focused on his role during the Holocaust, actually represents one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the entire 1930s, with effects that extended far beyond the immediate period of the Purge, shaping the quality of Soviet military command during the decisive years of the conflict against Germany. The man Hitler called the most dangerous man in the Reich. Adolf Hitler privately described Heydrich as the man with the iron heart, and according to testimonies collected from those close to him, even referred to him as one of the most dangerous figures within the Nazi hierarchy, not because of his overt political ambition, but because of the amount of compromising information he accumulated on virtually all the regime's senior leaders. As head of the security service, Heydrich kept detailed dossiers on the private lives, finances, and possible ideological deviations of figures such as Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, and other top-level leaders. This accumulation of sensitive material created a peculiar balance of power. No Nazi dignitary felt completely safe in the face of Heydrich, including Himmler, his direct superior, who on occasion expressed misgivings about his subordinates' growing influence. Goebbels even noted in his personal diary a certain unease about the degree of control Heydrich exercised over the party's internal intelligence archives. This dynamic of mutual surveillance within the Nazi circle itself rarely appears in accounts focused exclusively on his crimes against civilian populations, but it is key to understanding why some historians consider that Heydrich, had he survived the war, had prospects for power that could have rivaled those of Himmler, or even in a hypothetical scenario in which the regime lasted longer, those of Hitler's own inner circle. The very name by which Hitler distinguished him, the man with the iron heart, emerged in the context of a speech delivered after Heydrich's death, but historians who have reviewed correspondence and notes from previous meetings point out that the expression reflected an assessment that Hitler had already held privately for years, specifically linked to Heydrich's ability to make drastic decisions without apparent emotional hesitation. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, described the atmosphere of tension that arose in meetings attended by Heydrich and other dignitaries, noting an almost feline quality in his way of observing and identifying the weaknesses of others. Himmler, aware of this dynamic, attempted on more than one occasion to limit Heydrich's direct access to certain sensitive information without much success, since the very structure of the security service that Heydrich had built guaranteed flows of information that escaped the effective control of any hierarchical superior. This combination of exceptional technical competence and opacity regarding his true intentions led historians such as Eduard Kallik to argue, in studies published during the second half of the 20th century, that Heydrich represented the most refined model of terror technocrat produced by the Nazi regime, a figure capable of operating with absolute administrative efficiency, regardless of the human cost of his decisions. The silent architect of the Einsatzgruppen. Long before the Wannsee Conference, Heydrich designed the operational structure of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads that followed the German army during the invasion of Poland in 1939 and with greater intensity during the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. These units were responsible for the systematic murder of more than 1 million people, mostly Jews, through mass shootings in communal graves before the infrastructure of the extermination camps existed. The logistical planning, the recruitment of personnel drawn from the police, the SS and the security service, and coordination with the military high command fell directly to Heydrich's office. Documents from the Nuremberg trials reveal explicit instructions drafted or authorized by him, which established detailed protocols on how to proceed with the civilian population in the occupied territories of the East. Unlike the Wannsee Conference, which attracts public attention because of its nature as a formal meeting and its documented minutes, the earlier work of designing the operational structure of the Einsatzgruppen receives far less coverage in popular culture, despite representing an earlier phase, and, in terms of direct victims at the hands of his subordinates, one comparable in scale to that later managed by the extermination camps. The directives that Heydrich issued before the invasion of Poland, known as the Prech instructions after the training location of the assigned officers, established specific categories of population to be eliminated, including members of the Polish intelligentsia, Catholic clergy, Jewish community leaders, and anyone identified as a potential center of organized resistance. This prior classification of targets, prepared months in advance of the invasion, demonstrates a level of systematic planning that contradicts the idea, still present in simplified accounts, that the Nazi genocide was improvised exclusively as wartime events unfolded. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, Heydrich considerably expanded the mandate of the Einsatzgruppen, authorizing the systematic inclusion of Jewish women and children among the victims beginning in the summer of 1941, an escalation documented in internal reports that he himself received periodically and summarized for Himmler. Historians such as Christopher Browning have pointed out that this progression, from shootings initially directed at men of fighting age to the indiscriminate extermination of entire communities, reflects decisions made consciously and in stages by the leadership headed by Heydrich, and not a merely chaotic process resulting from the pressure of the battlefield. Each Einsatzgruppe sent Heydrich's office periodic reports known as operational situation reports from the USSR, documents that detailed with numerical precision the total number of executions carried out in each locality, classified by victim category. Heydrich personally reviewed summaries of these reports and compiled them for distribution among other senior leaders, a practice that demonstrates the degree of direct supervision he exercised over operations that, on the surface, were taking place hundreds of kilometers from his Berlin desk. Historians who have worked with surviving copies of these reports, partially preserved in US military archives captured at the end of the war, have calculated that during just the first 6 months of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the figures reported to Heydrich's office exceeded 500,000 victims, a volume of deaths that preceded by more than a year the full operation of the extermination camps that would later concentrate the predominant historical attention on the Nazi genocide. The Wannsee meeting lasted less than 90 minutes. The Wannsee Conference, convened and chaired by Heydrich on January 20, 1942, in a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin, is often described in popular culture as the moment when the systematic extermination of European Jews was decided. Documentary evidence shows, however, that the fundamental political decision had already been underway for months, and that the meeting's main purpose was to coordinate administrative logistics among the various ministries and agencies involved in what the regime euphemistically called the final solution of the Jewish question. According to the only surviving minutes, drafted by Adolf Eichmann under Heydrich's supervision, the meeting brought together 15 senior officials and lasted approximately 90 minutes, followed by a toast with cognac. In that brief period, figures for the Jewish population in various European countries, calculated at more than 11 million people, were discussed, and mechanisms of interministerial cooperation for mass deportation to the East were established. The brevity of the meeting contrasts remarkably with the historical magnitude attributed to it and reveals the extent to which the Nazi bureaucratic machinery had normalized the planning of genocide as just another administrative procedure, managed with the same coldness as any other government coordination meeting. The Wannsee Minutes, technically known as the Wannsee Protocol, survived by pure chance. One of the few copies originally distributed, addressed to the Foreign Ministry, escaped the systematic destruction of compromising documents that the Nazi authorities undertook in the final months of the war, and was discovered by Allied investigators in 1947 among ministry archives. The document uses deliberately euphemistic administrative language, referring to deportations as evacuations to the east, and to mass murder through terms such as appropriate treatment, a linguistic coding that Heydrich and Eichmann consistently employed to formally distance official documentation from the criminal reality it described. Among those attending were representatives of ministries as diverse as Justice, Interior and Foreign Affairs, as well as officials from the occupied regions of Poland, which confirms that the coordination sought to involve the entirety of the German state apparatus in the logistical execution of the deportations, distributing administrative responsibilities among multiple agencies to dilute the concentration of guilt in a single institution. Later studies, including those of historian Mark Roseman, have emphasized that the meeting's true function was to assert Heydrich's centralizing authority over the process, ensuring that no ministry could later obstruct, for bureaucratic or jurisdictional reasons, the implementation of the mass deportations already decided upon, where the nickname the Butcher of Prague came from. After his appointment as Reich Protector in Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941, Heydrich implemented a dual strategy known to historians as the carrot-and-stick policy. On the one hand, he ordered summary executions and the declaration of martial law, which in the first days of his administration resulted in hundreds of shootings of figures from the Czech resistance and citizens identified as disaffected with the regime. On the other hand, he introduced concrete improvements in the working conditions of Czech industrial workers, including increases in food rations, improvements in social insurance, and the organization of state-subsidized recreational programs with the aim of keeping Czech industrial production stable, essential to the German war effort. This combination of selective terror and calculated material concessions proved extremely effective. The organized Czech resistance weakened considerably during the months of his mandate, and arms production at the Skoda factories, vital to the German war machine, remained at high levels. The nickname Butcher of Prague describes only the repressive half of this strategy. The other half, less frequently mentioned in popular accounts, demonstrates a level of sophistication in the management of occupied populations that various military analysts studied after the war as a model of efficient authoritarian control. Among the concrete measures of the concessions phase was the creation of subsidized industrial canteens that guaranteed one hot meal a day to workers in armaments factories, in addition to the organization of recreational excursions and free cultural events aimed specifically at the Czech working population, in an explicit attempt to replicate within the Protectorate the strength through joy model of social organization that the Nazi regime applied in German territory. At the same time, Heydrich completely reorganized the Protectorate's police and intelligence system, dismantling resistance networks through systematic infiltration and executing more than 4,000 people identified as opponents during the first months of his administration, according to figures collected in post-war archives of the Czechoslovak administration. This combination proved so effective that historians such as Chad Bryant have pointed out that in terms of administrative stability and industrial productivity, Heydrich's administration in Bohemia and Moravia represented one of the most successful models of occupation from the strictly German perspective in all of occupied Europe, an efficiency that helps explain why the Czechoslovak government in exile considered eliminating him a priority, even at the risk of severe reprisals against the civilian population. Heydrich also reformed the Protectorate's judicial system, establishing special emergency courts with the authority to hand down death sentences through highly summary procedures without the possibility of appeal, applicable to any act considered sabotage, hostile propaganda, or disobedience to the occupation authorities. This judicial reform operated in parallel with the creation of a system of paid informants, organized into neighborhood networks that covered both urban and rural areas of the Protectorate, generating a climate of mutual distrust among the Czech population that considerably hindered the reconstruction of coordinated resistance structures during the months following his arrival. Czech officials who collaborated with the German administration during this period, interviewed decades later by academic researchers, described Heydrich's administration as exceptionally meticulous compared with occupation administrators in other European territories, a meticulousness that was reflected both in repressive planning and in the design of material incentives intended to keep industrial productivity under control. The plan to kidnap the Czechoslovak president in exile, Among the lesser-known projects attributed to Heydrich was an intelligence plan designed to discredit, and in more extreme versions documented in SS correspondence, kidnap Edvard Beneš, the Czechoslovak president exiled in London and a central figure of the Czech resistance abroad. The objective was to weaken the legitimacy of the government in exile and simultaneously sow distrust among the Western Allies regarding the reliability of Czechoslovak intelligence, which according to Heydrich had been infiltrated by double agents favorable to Germany. Part of this operation included the dissemination of information, partly fabricated and partly real, about alleged leaks within Beneš's circle, generating episodes of paranoia and internal purges among the Czechoslovak intelligence services in London. Some historians maintain that this disinformation campaign had an unexpected and crucial collateral effect. It contributed to the British intelligence services and the Czechoslovak government in exile, accelerating the planning of a high-impact operation against Heydrich himself, precisely to demonstrate that the Czech resistance remained a force capable of striking at the heart of the occupation apparatus. If this interpretation is correct, the disinformation campaign that Heydrich designed against Beneš would have contributed indirectly to precipitating the attack that would end his own life months later. The disinformation operation against Beneš relied in part on double agents whom Heydrich himself had cultivated within the Czechoslovak intelligence network since before the annexation of the Protectorate, taking advantage of contacts established during the years when Czechoslovakia still maintained formal diplomatic relations with Germany. British intelligence documents declassified in recent decades reveal that the British Secret Intelligence Service came to suspect, for a brief period in 1941, that some of the information received about the internal situation in the Protectorate might come from sources compromised by Heydrich's own apparatus, which generated considerable internal tensions between the Allied intelligence services and the Czechoslovak government in exile. Some historians, including Callum MacDonald, maintain that these tensions of trust, combined with Beneš's political need to demonstrate that the Czech resistance remained a relevant force capable of acting, formed part of the strategic calculation that led to the approval of a high-profile operation against the highest occupation authority, in an attempt to restore both the internal morale of the resistance and the credibility of the government in exile before its Western allies. He controlled Interpol from his office in Berlin, a fact that surprises even specialists unfamiliar with the administrative intricacies of the Nazi regime is that Heydrich held, between 1940 and his death in 1942, the presidency of the International Criminal Police Commission, the direct predecessor of today's Interpol. Following the German occupation of several European countries, the organization's headquarters, originally based in Vienna, came under the effective control of the Nazi authorities, and Heydrich formally assumed its leadership, integrating its archives and its international police cooperation network into the structure of the SS security service. This meant that for almost 2 years, an organization conceived to facilitate police cooperation against common crime throughout the world was, in practice, subordinated to the planning of the Nazi regime's racial and political persecution. The organization's archives, including databases on international criminals, were used to track political opponents and, in some documented cases, to locate people of Jewish origin who had fled to different European countries. Modern Interpol officially acknowledged this episode in its own institutional history several decades later, describing it as one of the darkest periods in the organization's history, a fact rarely mentioned in narratives focused exclusively on Heydrich's profile within the SS hierarchy. The organization's Vienna headquarters, occupied by the SS shortly after the annexation of Austria in 1938, held detailed archives on international police cooperation accumulated since the institution's founding in 1923, material that Heydrich considered of enormous strategic value in supplementing the databases already maintained by the SS security service on political opponents, criminals, and increasingly the Jewish population under surveillance. Under his formal presidency, the organization maintained a certain appearance of institutional normality, including correspondence with police forces in countries that were still neutral or unoccupied, which generated episodes of considerable diplomatic discomfort when some of those national police forces discovered, once the war was already well underway, that they were exchanging information with a structure directly subordinated to the Nazi repressive apparatus. Interpol itself, in institutional documents published on its official website during the 21st century, acknowledged this period as an illegitimate appropriation of its structure and archives, and detailed how much of the database accumulated during the years of Nazi control had to be purged after the war to eliminate biases resulting from the racial and political persecution that had guided its use during the period under the control of Heydrich and, after his death, his successor in the position, Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Nazi control over the organization remained practically invisible to the international public for much of the war, since official communications with neutral countries retained a conventional administrative format that gave no indication of the substantial change in purpose the institution had undergone. Some police archives from countries such as Sweden and Switzerland, reviewed by researchers in recent decades, show that certain local police authorities maintained routine correspondence with the Vienna headquarters without being fully aware that they were interacting in practice with an operational extension of Heydrich's apparatus. After the end of the war, the reconstruction of the organization as modern Interpol involved a deliberate process of institutional distancing from this period, including the relocation of the headquarters to France and a complete review of governance protocols to prevent similar centralized control from being repeated in the future, an institutional lesson that the organization itself occasionally cites in internal documents on its founding history. The personal file that Hitler ordered destroyed after his death. After Heydrich's death, Hitler ordered an exhaustive review of his personal and administrative files, with specific instructions regarding the destruction of certain documents considered too sensitive to be preserved even within the regime's closed inner circle. Historians who have studied the surviving partial records suggest that the destroyed material included not only the compromising dossiers that Heydrich kept on other Nazi dignitaries mentioned previously, but also documentation related to covert negotiations and intelligence contacts that his office had maintained with governments and organizations outside the traditional Nazi axis of power, including possible channels of indirect communication with sectors of the Soviet apparatus during the period of the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, in force until 1941. The exact nature of these contacts remained shrouded in documentary uncertainty, since the destruction ordered by Hitler eliminated much of the primary evidence. This documentary gap has fueled, among historians specializing in Second World War intelligence, various hypotheses about the true scope of the covert operations that Heydrich coordinated beyond his publicly known role, turning this episode into one of the most discussed, though least resolved, blind spots in his biography. The urgency with which Hitler acted after Heydrich's death is striking, even considering the general context of secrecy that characterized the regime. Witnesses close to the Chancellery recounted that as soon as the death was confirmed, the immediate transfer of boxes of documents from Heydrich's office in Berlin to a destination that was never recorded in the administrative archives available after the war was ordered. Researchers who have attempted to reconstruct the contents of those files from indirect references in the correspondence of other dignitaries point out that part of the material may have been related to covert financial negotiations that the security service maintained with Swiss banks to channel assets confiscated from victims of racial persecution, a matter that, had it come to light prematurely, would have generated significant diplomatic friction with neutral countries whose banking cooperation was essential to the German war economy. Other historians point to a different hypothesis, linked to exploratory peace contacts that certain sectors of the German intelligence apparatus may have maintained without formal authorization with Allied representatives through intermediaries in neutral countries such as Switzerland or Sweden, contacts that Heydrich, given his position of control over all sensitive intelligence communications, would necessarily have known about or supervised to some degree. None of these hypotheses has definitive documentary confirmation, precisely because of the destruction ordered after his death, which keeps this chapter as one of the most debated among intelligence specialists of the period. The unarmored Mercedes convertible that sealed his fate. On May 27, 1942, Heydrich was traveling from his residence on the outskirts of Prague to Prague Castle in a Mercedes-Benz 320 convertible, a vehicle chosen for its representative character but lacking any type of armor, a decision that reflected the excessive confidence Heydrich placed in the control he believed he had established over Czech territory. The car also had no significant armed escort beyond the chauffeur on a route he traveled routinely and predictably, a movement pattern that greatly facilitated the planning of the attack by the Czechoslovak parachute agents trained in Britain. During the attack carried out by Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis at a sharp curve in the Liban district, Gabčík's automatic weapon jammed at the critical moment, a mechanical failure that might have saved Heydrich's life had Kubis not immediately thrown a modified anti-tank grenade that detonated near the vehicle. Shrapnel fragments, together with material from the seat upholstery and the structure of the car, penetrated Heydrich's body, causing injuries that at first did not appear fatal. The choice of an unarmored convertible vehicle, motivated by protocol and public image considerations, ultimately became a determining factor in the outcome of the operation, a technical detail that various military analysts identify as an avoidable personal security failure for someone of his rank and level of exposure to reprisals. Karl Hermann Frank, his second-in-command in the Protectorate, had repeatedly warned of the advisability of using armored vehicles and strengthening the escort given the growing number of intelligence reports indicating possible activity by parachutists trained in Britain operating in Czech territory since late 1941. Heydrich repeatedly dismissed these recommendations, convinced that his policy of control through selective terror and calculated concessions had effectively neutralized any significant operational capability of the Czech resistance, an assessment that later evidence proved mistaken. The daily route itself between his residence, known as Panenské Breziny and Prague Castle, followed a fixed path documented by the resistance network for weeks before the attack, including approximate departure times that varied little from one day to another. Gabčík and Kubis specifically chose the Liban curve because it forced the vehicle to reduce speed drastically, maximizing the window of opportunity for an attack with short-range weapons, a tactical planning detail that demonstrates the level of prior reconnaissance carried out by the agents before executing the operation. The weaponry used by the agents had been supplied by the British Special Operations Executive, including a British-made Sten submachine gun, known for its inconsistent mechanical reliability, a documented design flaw in other contexts of the conflict, that on this occasion came close to completely thwarting the operation. The anti-tank grenade used by Kubis, originally designed to penetrate vehicle armor, proved in practice more lethal against Heydrich than a conventional gunshot would have been, since the fragmentation generated by the explosion introduced contaminated material into his body from both the vehicle and possibly Heydrich's own uniform, considerably complicating subsequent medical treatment. After the initial attack, both agents managed to escape by bicycle amid the confusion generated by the explosion, a flight that, despite the seriousness of the situation, unfolded with the methodical, calm characteristic of the training received in Britain, thus avoiding an immediate pursuit that could have compromised the entire operation in its first minutes. He died from an infection, not from the direct explosion. Contrary to the popular perception that Heydrich died instantly, or as a direct result of the explosion, documented medical evidence establishes that he survived for several days after the attack. Transferred to Bulovka Hospital in Prague, doctors removed shrapnel fragments and reconstructed part of the damaged tissue in the abdomen and diaphragm, and during the first few days his condition showed signs of relative improvement. However, he developed a generalized infection identified as septicemia, which medical historians attribute in part to fragments of the car's upholstery, possibly made with horsehair or treated cotton, that remained lodged in the wound and encouraged bacterial proliferation in a context in which modern antibiotics, such as penicillin, were not yet generally available in German medicine at the time. Hitler ordered the urgent transfer of a personal specialist, Professor Karl Gebhardt, an SS physician, who decided not to administer treatment with the available sulfonamides, a decision that some medical historians have retrospectively questioned as potentially counterproductive. Heydrich went into septic shock and died on June 4, 1942, 8 days after the attack, in a process of progressive deterioration documented hour by hour in the hospital's medical records, far removed from the image of an instant and heroic death that subsequent Nazi propaganda attempted to construct around his figure. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, traveled to Prague together with Gebhardt to participate in the medical care, and the correspondence between the two specialists, partially preserved in post-war medical archives, reveals differences of opinion over the proper treatment that generated tension even during the days when the patient was in the most serious condition. Gebhardt, motivated in part by his professional rivalry with other doctors in the regime and his interest in demonstrating the superiority of treatments based on surgery and rest over the widespread use of sulfonamides, opted for an approach that several specialists consulted after the war described as excessively conservative, given the severity of the infection that developed. Some medical historians have pointed out that this decision may have been influenced by Gebhardt's own desire to validate research he was simultaneously conducting on treatments alternative to antibiotics, experiments that would later be linked to criminal medical procedures performed on prisoners at Ravensbrück concentration camp. The irony that Heydrich, architect of a system that systematically dehumanized millions of people, ultimately became an indirect victim of the professional ambitions of an SS physician interested in validating his own clinical theories, constitutes one of the least publicized details of his final outcome. The reprisal against Lidice had no direct connection to the village that was chosen. After Heydrich's death, the Nazi regime ordered a massive reprisal that culminated in the total destruction of the village of Lidice on June 10, 1942. German forces shot all the adult men in the village, around 173 people, deported the women to concentration camps, and sent most of the children to forced Germanization programs, or in several documented cases, to centers where they were killed by gas. The village was subsequently completely razed, with its buildings demolished and the land leveled to erase any physical trace of its existence. The choice of Lidice as the target of the reprisal was, according to post-war investigations, practically arbitrary. The occupation authorities based their decision on an anonymous and erroneous denunciation that linked the village to resistance activities, a connection that later investigations proved non-existent. No inhabitant of Lidice had any involvement whatsoever in the planning or execution of the attack against Heydrich, which had been organized entirely by agents trained in Britain and supported by a resistance network based in Prague, completely unrelated to the village. The scale of the reprisal, disproportionate even by the standards of terror that the Nazi regime itself habitually applied, generated considerable international outrage and contributed to various cities and towns in several countries, including the United States, Mexico, and Brazil, later renaming places Lidice in memory of the victims. The denunciation that triggered the reprisal came from a letter found among the belongings of a Czech worker mobilized in Germany, in which relatives in a village whose name partially coincided with Lidice were mentioned ambiguously, a coincidence that the investigating authorities, pressured by the demand to show immediate results after Heydrich's death, interpreted without further verification as sufficient proof of complicity. Karl Hermann Frank, who assumed executive functions after Heydrich's death until the arrival of a new protector, personally authorized the operation, aware that the magnitude of the punishment would serve as an exemplary warning to the entire population of the Protectorate regardless of the actual strength of the available evidence. A second village, Lazaki, suffered similar destruction weeks later for equally tenuous reasons, related to the discovery of a clandestine radio transmitter linked to another resistance cell completely different from the one that had carried out the attack. The combination of both episodes consolidated among the Czech population a sense of generalized terror that, as historians such as Mark Cornwall document, contributed decisively to drastically reducing organized armed resistance activity in the Protectorate during the remainder of the German occupation. State funerals worthy of a head of government. The Nazi regime organized funerals for Heydrich on an exceptional scale, comparable to those dedicated to heads of state. His body was first transferred to Prague, where a public ceremony with military honors was held, and subsequently to Berlin, where Hitler personally presided over a state funeral at the Reich Chancellery, posthumously awarding him the Blood Order and the German Cross in gold, two of the regime's highest distinctions. Himmler delivered a speech praising his organizational ability and loyalty, while the Nazi propaganda machinery, directed by Goebbels, transformed the figure of Heydrich into an official martyr of National Socialism, presenting him to the German population as an example of sacrifice for the cause of the Reich. This propaganda operation included the production of a documentary short film, the issuance of commemorative postage stamps, and the renaming of several institutions and streets in his honor, among them the operation that would bear the code name Operation Reinhard to refer to the phase of systematic extermination of Jews in the camps of Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, formally established as a tribute to his memory just weeks after his death. The contrast between the magnitude of these public honors and the simultaneous reprisal against literature illustrates the dual function that the regime assigned to Heydrich's death, consolidating him as a symbol of heroic sacrifice for the German public, while using his assassination as justification to intensify terror against the occupied populations. The Berlin ceremony included a funeral procession along the capital's main avenues, with the presence of military delegations from Axis-allied countries, including representatives of Italy and collaborationist governments of Eastern Europe, in a protocol display usually reserved for heads of state. Himmler used the funeral speech to formally announce the creation of Operation Reinhard as a tribute to Heydrich's memory, explicitly establishing that the 3 extermination camps that formed part of it, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, would carry out the process of systematic extermination of the Jewish population of the General Government of Poland under his name. This direct link between a funeral tribute and the formal inauguration of the deadliest phase of the Holocaust, in terms of the number of victims concentrated within a relatively brief period, constitutes one of the most explicit examples of how the Nazi regime integrated the cult of its own martyrs with the operational planning of genocide. Lena Heydrich, his widow, received a generous lifelong pension and a property confiscated from a Czech family as additional compensation, benefits that she partially retained even after the end of the war, since she managed to avoid significant judicial convictions despite her known ideological affinity with the regime and her active role in advancing her husband's career. The theories questioning whether the British operation was really a clean success. Operation Anthropoid, the code name for the attack on Heydrich, continues to generate historiographical debate decades after its execution, particularly regarding the decisions made by the British Special Operations Executive, the organization that trained and coordinated the Czechoslovak agents responsible for the attack. Declassified documents show that some sectors within British intelligence and the Czechoslovak government in exile anticipated, before authorizing the operation, that Nazi reprisals would be severe and would possibly affect innocent civilian populations, a prediction that did not prevent the execution of the plan. This circumstance has fueled a sustained ethical and historiographical debate over whether the decision to proceed, knowing in advance the habitual pattern of collective reprisals that the Nazi regime systematically applied, should have been weighed differently. Some historians suggest that the Czechoslovak government in exile, led by Beneš, considered the attack strategically valuable precisely because the expected reprisals would strengthen the Allied cause and consolidate the international recognition of Czechoslovakia as an occupied nation deserving full territorial restitution after the war. A political calculation that, if confirmed in its entirety, would add an additional layer of moral complexity to an episode generally narrated in exclusively heroic terms. The academic discussion on this point remains open, sustained by divergent interpretations of the diplomatic and intelligence correspondence available in British and Czech archives. Czech historian Jan Kalous, together with other researchers who have worked with archives of the Czechoslovak Ministry of the Interior, declassified after the end of the communist regime, has documented that within the government in exile itself there were conflicting positions regarding the advisability of the operation, with some military advisors explicitly warning that the probable human cost would far exceed the symbolic benefit of eliminating a single figure, however relevant he might be within the occupation hierarchy. Beneš, according to these sources, decided to proceed despite these warnings, motivated in part by the need to counter diplomatic negotiations that were then advancing among Western powers regarding the future of Czechoslovakia's post-war borders, a scenario in which demonstrating a capacity for active resistance was politically crucial to strengthening the Czechoslovak negotiating position. The debate over this decision was strongly revived during commemorations of the anniversary of the attack in different decades, generating opposing positions between those who defend the unquestionable symbolic and military value of the operation and those who consider that the cost to the civilian population should have been incorporated more explicitly into the strategic calculation prior to its authorization. Winston Churchill, according to later accounts by members of his war cabinet, expressed explicit satisfaction upon learning the news of the attack, considering it a significant moral blow against the Nazi occupation apparatus in Central Europe, an assessment that contrasted with the caution initially shown by some British intelligence advisers concerned about the foreseeable humanitarian consequences. This difference in perspectives within the Allied leadership itself illustrates the permanent tension between strategic wartime considerations and the direct human cost to populations under occupation, a dilemma that military historiography has revisited on numerous occasions when analyzing similar special operations carried out during the Second World War in different theaters of the conflict. The small, unresolved mysteries of his private life. After the attack, the 7 Czechoslovak paratroopers directly or indirectly involved in the operation, including Gabčík and Kubis, took refuge in the crypt of the Orthodox Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague. They remained hidden for several weeks until, on June 18, 1942, SS forces surrounded the church after receiving precise information about their location. After a prolonged confrontation, the agents died in the crypt, several of them by suicide to avoid capture. The identity of the person who provided the decisive information to the Nazi authorities was officially established. Karel Kurda, a member of another group of paratroopers, betrayed his comrades in exchange for a substantial financial reward offered by the Gestapo. However, various researchers have pointed out inconsistencies in the exact chronology of how the Gestapo reached Kurda's confession, including the possibility that more than one source of information was circulating in parallel within the Czech resistance networks, infiltrated to varying degrees by double agents whose complete identity was never established with absolute certainty in the archives available after the war. This documentary grey area, combined with the destruction of relevant files during the final months of the Nazi regime, keeps open among some researchers the question of whether the Czech resistance network that supported Operation Anthropoid had been compromised from an earlier stage than the official post-war version, focused exclusively on Kurda's individual betrayal, has allowed to be established. Kurda received from the Gestapo a reward equivalent to 1 million Czechoslovak crowns, as well as a new identity and protection, benefits that he retained for the rest of the war while actively collaborating with the occupation authorities in the identification of other members of the resistance. After the end of the conflict, he was captured, tried by a Czechoslovak court, and executed in 1947 in a process that documented in detail his role in the downfall of the agents, but which left some questions about the exact chronology of the days preceding the siege of the crypt conclusively unresolved. Partial Gestapo documents discovered in scattered archives after the war suggest that the occupation authorities already possessed certain information about suspicious movements around the Orthodox Church before Kurda's formal confession, which has led some researchers to propose the hypothesis of a second source of information, possibly linked to the very infiltration that Heydrich's apparatus had managed to establish months earlier within various resistance cells. The priest of the church, together with the Orthodox bishop of the region, were subsequently executed by the Nazi authorities under the accusation of having provided shelter to the agents, an additional reprisal added to those already carried out against Lidice and Ležáky, completing one of the most intense periods of terror suffered by the Czech population during the entire occupation. Beyond the rumor about Jewish ancestry, Heydrich's family biography contains other episodes that the Nazi propaganda apparatus simplified or directly rewrote in order to construct a narrative more convenient for its ideological purposes. His father, Bruno Heydrich, came from a modest artistic background and faced recurring financial difficulties in managing the music conservatory he founded, a reality that later official biography transformed into the story of a successful and recognized composer, exaggerating artistic achievements that contemporary documentary evidence does not support to the same extent. Heydrich's mother, Elisabeth Krantz, came from a family with a certain Prussian military tradition, a lineage that Nazi propaganda extensively exploited to link Heydrich to a supposed inherited tradition of martial discipline, in deliberate contrast with the artistic and economically unstable origins of the paternal branch, which was less useful for constructing the image of a racial warrior that the regime wished to project onto one of its most prominent figures. This editorial selection of family genealogy, documented by historians who have compared the original civil records with the biographical materials officially published during the Third Reich, exemplifies how even the apparently minor details of the private lives of Nazi dignitaries were subjected to a systematic process of ideological rewriting intended to maximize their propaganda usefulness. Reinhard and Lena Heydrich had 4 children, whose later trajectories reveal another little explored layer of the family history. Klaus, the eldest son, died in 1943 at the age of 10 after being run over by a German military vehicle near the family residence in Prague, an accidental death that occurred barely a year after his father's assassination, and that generated, according to testimonies from the time, a profound emotional crisis in Reinhard Heydrich, already devastated by the loss of her husband. Haida, the second son, was born with a severe visual disability, a circumstance that various biographers have pointed out as a historically uncomfortable fact within a family whose patriarch had actively contributed to the implementation of policies of eugenics and extermination of people with disabilities within German territory itself, within the framework of the program known as Action T4. Silke, the only daughter, and Marta, the youngest, maintained considerably lower public profiles in the decades after the war, largely avoiding the media exposure that their mother did seek, who in 1976 published memoirs titled Life with a War Hero, in which she defended the figure of her husband and systematically minimized his direct responsibility in the genocide, a work that generated considerable controversy among historians and associations of Holocaust victims because of the markedly apologetic tone of its content. Reinhard Heydrich lived until 1985, maintaining until the end of her life a family narrative that contrasted notably with the historical documentation accumulated regarding her husband's role in the Nazi extermination machinery. The figure of Heydrich has been represented in numerous cinematic and literary productions since the end of the war, beginning with films made almost in real time after his death, such as Hangmen Also Die, directed by Fritz Lang in 1943 with a screenplay co-written by Bertolt Brecht, which freely dramatized the attack with considerable liberties regarding the documented facts. Later productions, including Conspiracy, released in 2001 and specifically centered on the reconstruction of the Wannsee Conference, opted for an approach more closely aligned with the available historical documentation, relying directly on the surviving protocol of the meeting to reconstruct dialogues and dynamics among the attendees with considerable precision. The novel HHHH by French writer Laurent Binet, published in 2010, popularized among the general public numerous biographical details of Heydrich, previously confined to specialized academic circles, although it also generated methodological debate about the boundaries between documented historical reconstruction and narrative speculation, in a genre that combines both registers. This proliferation of cultural representations, combined with the inherently cinematic character of the Prague attack itself, has paradoxically contributed to certain more spectacular aspects of Heydrich's biography, such as the attack itself and his subsequent agony, receiving disproportionate attention compared with the administrative and bureaucratic aspects of his career, which, despite being less cinematic, constituted in terms of historical consequences the most decisive and lethal contribution of his entire career within the Nazi apparatus. The relationship between Heydrich and Himmler, usually presented as a close and seamless ideological alliance, in reality contained layers of latent rivalry documented by historians who have studied internal SS correspondence. Himmler, trained in agronomy and with an intellectual profile considerably more closely linked to racial esotericism and the pseudo-scientific mysticism that characterized part of Nazi thought, depended to a large extent on Heydrich's organizational ability and administrative efficiency to translate his ideological directives into functional operational structures. This dependence generated in Himmler a mixture of professional recognition and personal distrust, aggravated by reports he periodically received about Heydrich's growing prestige among other sectors of the regime, including Hitler's own close entourage. Documents from the period reveal that Himmler blocked on more than one occasion promotions or expansions of authority requested by Heydrich, a bureaucratic friction that both handled carefully so as not to project outward any indication of division within the SS leadership. Some historians, including Robert Gerwarth, maintain that Heydrich's appointment as Protector of Bohemia and Moravia in 1941, officially presented as a significant promotion, may also have responded to Himmler's interest in moving an increasingly influential subordinate away from the nerve center of power in Berlin, distancing him from direct daily contact with Hitler that Himmler preferred to keep under his own exclusive control. This interpretation, supported by circumstantial evidence rather than explicit documentation, adds an additional layer of complexity to the relationship between the two dignitaries, usually simplified in general accounts of the SS power structure as a harmonious collaboration between mentor and loyal subordinate. The detailed reconstruction of Heydrich's agony, preserved in records from Bulovka Hospital, became decades later an object of study for specialists in military medicine and the history of medicine, interested in analyzing the therapeutic limitations of the period in the face of severe bacterial infections in a wartime context. The medical team documented hour by hour the evolution of the patient's vital signs, including episodes of intermittent high fever, progressive deterioration of respiratory function, and finally a case of disseminated intravascular coagulation that modern specialists identify as a direct consequence of septicemia not controlled in time. Researchers who reviewed this file during the second half of the 20th century pointed out that had early treatment with sulfonamides been available, or, in an even more favorable scenario, with penicillin, whose widespread clinical use in the Allied sphere was beginning to expand precisely during that period, the chances of survival would have increased considerably. This circumstance adds an additional layer of historical contingency to Heydrich's final outcome. His death did not derive exclusively from the effectiveness of the attack planned in London and carried out in Prague, but also from specific medical decisions and specific technological limitations of German medicine in 1942, a combination of factors that together sealed the fate of one of the most effective and lethal administrators produced by the security apparatus of the Third Reich. One aspect of Heydrich's administration that receives little attention outside specialized academic circles is his role in organizing the system of economic plunder linked to the deportations. Under his direct supervision, the SS Security Service established detailed protocols for the systematic confiscation of property, bank accounts, jewelry and real estate belonging to deported persons, a process that generated substantial income partially redirected toward financing the repressive machinery itself. Heydrich ordered the creation of specific offices responsible for cataloguing and auctioning confiscated goods in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a mechanism that combined ideological dispossession with precise economic calculation, aimed at sustaining the operation of an apparatus whose scale of personnel and logistics required constant financing. Partial accounting documents preserved in Czech and German banking archives show that part of these funds was also channeled into accounts linked to intelligence operations abroad, including the payment of informants and the financing of espionage networks that Heydrich himself coordinated beyond the borders of the occupied territory. This financial dimension, generally overshadowed in accounts focused on direct physical violence, reveals the extent to which the structure Heydrich built deliberately integrated the economic component as an inseparable part of its operation, turning the material dispossession of the victims into yet another cog in a machinery designed to sustain itself with the greatest possible efficiency. The 18 layers of information gathered throughout this account show the same individual from perspectives that rarely coincide in a single popular narrative. The violinist who rehearsed chamber pieces coexists with the designer of the Einsatzgruppen. The naval officer expelled for improper conduct coexists with the formal president of an international police cooperation organization. The man whose death the Nazi regime turned into the founding myth of one of the deadliest phases of the Holocaust coexists with a patient whose 8-day agony was recorded in clinical details that any modern hospital would recognize as a treatable infection. Each of these fragments, independently documented in military, judicial, medical and diplomatic archives scattered across different countries, together compose a considerably more complex portrait than the standard biographical summary that usually accompanies his name in general encyclopedias and mass-audience audiovisual productions. The continuing review of declassified archives in Russia, the Czech Republic, the United Kingdom and Germany suggests that the documented biography of Reinhard Heydrich, despite the decades that have passed since his death in 1942, has still not completely exhausted its capacity to reveal episodes that official history, for different political and narrative reasons, preferred to keep in the background. The legacy of a system that survived its architect. Heydrich's death did not stop the machinery he had designed. The Wannsee Conference and the administrative protocols he established continued operating under the direction of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, his successor as head of the Reich Main Security Office, and Adolf Eichmann, directly responsible for the logistics of the deportations. Operation Reinhard reached its peak lethality precisely in the months following the death of its namesake, with the Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka camps operating at sustained capacity until the end of 1943, when the Nazi authorities ordered their dismantling and the systematic elimination of physical evidence, including the exhumation and cremation of bodies previously buried in mass graves, in an attempt to erase traces in the face of the foreseeable advance of Soviet forces. Historians specializing in the Holocaust, among them Raoul Hilberg, have pointed out that the administrative efficiency Heydrich imposed on the entire system, from racial classification to the interministerial coordination demonstrated at Wannsee, functioned as a replicable model that perfectly survived his physical disappearance, evidence that the Nazi genocide depended on a bureaucratic structure designed to operate beyond any specific individual, including its principal architect. The Nuremberg trial, held between 1945 and 1946, could not directly try Heydrich for obvious reasons, but his name appeared constantly in the testimony of numerous defendants, who cited orders, directives and meetings chaired by him as a central part of the chain of command that led to the systematic extermination of millions of people. Adolf Eichmann, tried separately in Jerusalem in 1961, devoted a considerable part of his testimony to describing Heydrich's central role in the administrative conceptualization of the final solution, providing details about internal meetings and working methods that significantly complemented the historical knowledge available up to that point regarding the internal structure of the apparatus Heydrich had built. These later testimonies, together with declassified documents from Soviet, British and Czech archives during the final decades of the 20th century, made it possible to reconstruct more precisely episodes that for years remained shrouded in the simplified version that Nazi propaganda, and later, certain post-war narratives constructed around his figure. Specialized historiography continues to review specific aspects of Heydrich's biography as new archives are declassified in different countries, from Soviet military collections to Swiss banking documentation linked to SS financial operations. Each new documentary finding tends to confirm the general pattern established by consolidated historical research, while at the same time adding nuances regarding the exact magnitude of specific operations, such as the true extent of the intelligence manipulation against the Red Army or the precise content of the archives destroyed after his death. This combination of solid documentary certainties and areas of persistent uncertainty makes the biography of Reinhard Heydrich one of the most comprehensive case studies available on the articulation between personal ambition, exceptional administrative talent, and the construction of one of the deadliest systems of state violence documented in contemporary history.